The Recovery of the Heroic by Richard M. Weaver. The modern temper is losing the feeling for heroism even in war, which used to afford the supreme theme for celebration of this virtue. It is significant that, whereas wars were formerly spoken of as crusades, or at least as trials, it was the practice in America to refer to World War II as a job. These little changes in speech are as revealing as changes in dress. It was a job to be done so that the boys could get home to their bourgeois existences, which had not contemplated such a cataclysm and which had no nomenclature for it when it arrived. The organs of propaganda were hard put to convince the public that this was not just an ordinary job, since the reward was at best in intangibles, and since there might be no reward at all. Thus, we saw the constant reference to soldiers and workers, hours, and pay, in an effort to make the soldier see that he was fighting for something more than $50 a month, and to persuade the factory worker that the measure of his performance was not the wage earned, but what was being turned out for the front. It was an organized campaign, using all the resources of the great stereopticon to bring home to the people gone materialist the truth that sacrifice means not investment, but giving up something to the transcendental. During the early part of the Second World War, there came to light a story of a farmer from the back country of Oklahoma, one of the yet unspoiled, who, upon hearing of the attack on Pearl Harbor, departed with his wife to the West Coast to work in the shipyards. His wife found employment as a waitress and supported the two. Unable to read, the new worker did not understand the meaning of the little slip of paper handed him once a week. It was not until he had accumulated over $1,000 in checks that he found out that he was being paid to save his country. He had assumed that when the country is in danger, everyone helps out, and helping out means giving. On the other side, there is meaning in the one popular ballad to come out of World War II. Roger Young has the line, "Oh, we've got no time for glory in the infantry." The language of business was increasingly applied to war, as when soldier and sailor were displaced by the neuter servicemen. To say, "Our boy is in service," instead of, "Our son is fighting for his native land," pretty well empties out the heroic strain. The war of unlimited objectives, which the democracies waged at the end, may in fact be explained by the rage they felt over having their comfort disrupted and the contingent nature of the world exposed. In this rage, they made the egregious mistake of supposing that unconditional war is a means of doing away with all war. That may turn out to have been part of their unfitness. So much for physical conflict. Now we must pause to ask whether the spoiled child psychology does not unfit us also for that political struggle which now seems to loom inexorable. We have reference, naturally, to the new balance of power between East and West, between bourgeois liberal democracy and Soviet communism. With their ideal of happiness through comfort, the Western people looked forward to an era of undisturbed living in which such progress as their metaphysic demands will take the form of a conquest of nature. These conquests are threat enough to the prized equilibrium, if the truth were understood, but they may be little in comparison with the ideology fostered by their great rival to the East. For, however much the Bolsheviks have bemused themselves with other sophistries, they have never lost sight of the fact that life is a struggle. And since they see expansion as the price of survival, they are wholly committed to dynamism. To the leaders of Eastern communism, there is no such thing as a good neighbor policy in our sense. That would involve a respect for abstract rights. How they must chuckle over this fatuity of liberalism. They see the world in a mighty evolution, in which the abstract rights of individuals and of nations go down before irresistible processes. It is mainly this which makes the blue heaven of the Western liberals so precarious. What are the inalienable rights by which they demonstrate their claim to happiness, to that power whose metaphysical dream is dynamism? Even if we could assume pacific intentions on both sides, the future would not be safe for Western liberalism. Its fundamental incapacity to think, arising from an inability to see contradictions, deprives it of the power to propagate. Soviet communism, on the other hand, despite its ostensible commitment to materialism, has generated a body of ideas with a terrifying power to spread. And it is this impending defeat in the struggle to win adherents which will upset the balance and drive liberalism into loss of judgment and panic. One can almost say that this has now occurred. Editor's note. This was published in 1948. End of note. We see before us the paradox of materialist Russia expanding by the irresistible force of idea, while the United States, which supposedly has a heritage of values and ideals, frantically throwing up barricades of money around the globe. It will perhaps seem whimsical, but I have thought that the most promising bid for peace would be for the two great rivals to dispatch, each to the other, their ablest philosophers. Then we would see which side could convert the other with reference to the nature of the world and of man. And the world, having agreed in advance to abide by the decision, would thus be made one. This is the only hope for unity. The circumstance of living together in space and time has never yet made men peaceful. Rather, the contrary is true, and there are wise words by Hamilton in The Federalist. It has, from long observation of the progress of society, become a sort of axiom in politics that vicinity or nearness of situation constitutes nations' natural enemies. The supposition that science is uniting the nations by bringing them closer together physically is but another aspect of a theory previously noted that natural means can take the place of creed as the binding element. It is unlikely, therefore, that the era of soft living, which our scientists and advertisers have promised, will be realized on any condition. While these two worlds face each other, there seems to remain only the question of whether the West will allow comfort to soften it to a point at which defeat is assured, or whether it will accept the rule of hardness and discover means of discipline. If the latter course is chosen, it seems likely that the Western peoples are destined not for the happiness which they have promised themselves, but for something like Péguy's socialist poverty. In an effort to secure themselves against the challenge of dynamism, they will divert more of their substance and strength into armies and bureaucracies, the former to afford them protection from attack, the latter to effect internal order. In this event, personality will hardly survive. The individual will be told that the state is moving to guarantee his freedom, as in a sense it will be, but to do so, it must prohibit individual indulgence and even responsibility. To give strength to its will, the state restricts the wills of its citizens. This is a general formula of political organization. All such questions lead inevitably to the question of discipline. The Russians, with habitual clarity of purpose, have made their choice. There is to be discipline, and it is to be enforced by the elite controlling the state. Now, the significance of this for the West is that one choice is made for it too. There will be discipline here if the West is to survive. Organization always makes imperative counter-organization. A force in being is a threat to the unorganized, who must answer by becoming an organized force themselves. Thus, a great decision confronting the West in the future is how to overcome the spoiled child psychology sufficiently to discipline for struggle. The attempt of the United States to make military service attractive by offering high pay, free college education, and other benefits looks suspiciously like bribing the child with candy. In these ways, we get our reminders that science has not exempted us from struggle in life, though patterns change and deceive the shallow. The failure of discipline in empirical societies can be traced to a warfare between the productive and the consumptive faculties. The spoiled child is simply one who has been allowed to believe that his consumptive faculty can prescribe the order of society. How an entire social group may fall victim to this may be illustrated by the development of collective bargaining. Demagogic leaders have told the common man that he is entitled to much more than he is getting. They have not told him the less pleasant truth that, unless there is to be expropriation, which in any case is only a temporary resource, the increase must come out of greater productivity. Now, all productivity requires discipline and subordination. The simple endurance of toil requires control of passing desire. Here, man is in a peculiar dilemma. The more he has of liberty, the less he can have of the fruits of productive work. The more he is spoiled, the more he resents control, and thus he actually defeats the measures which would make possible a greater consumption. Undemocratic productivity is attacked by democratic consumption, and since there is no limit to appetite, there is no limit to the crippling of productive efficiency by the animal desire to consume, once it is in a position to make its force felt politically. Was there ever a more effective way to sabotage a nation's economy than to use the prestige of government to advocate the withholding of production? Strikes were originally regarded as conspiracies, and so they will have to be again when the free nations find collapse staring them in the face. What happens finally is that socialism, whose goal is materialism, meets the condition by turning authoritarian. That is to say, it is willing to institute control by dictation in order to raise living standards and not disappoint the consumptive soul. To the extent that socialism has done this by means of irrational appeals, and no others have been found efficacious in the long run, we have seen the establishment of fascist systems. We need go no further to see why self-advertised leaders of the masses today, whether they owe their offices to election or to coup d'etat, have turned dictator. They have had to perceive that what the masses needed was a plan for harmony and for work. Now, any plan, however arbitrary, will yield something better than chaos. This truth is merely a matter of definition. Accordingly, programs with fantastic objectives, some of them contradictory, have been set up. That they have put an end temporarily to disorder and frustration is historical fact. A study of their motivation, however, shows that they all had scapegoats. They were against something. The psychology of this should not be mystifying. The spoiled child is aggrieved and wants redress. A course of action which keeps him occupied while allowing him to express his resentments seems perfect. We should recall the strange melange of persons whom fascism cast in the role of villain: aristocrats, intellectuals, millionaires, members of racial minorities. In the United States, there has been a similar tendency officially to castigate economic royalists, managers of industry, Bourbons, and all who on any grounds could be considered privileged. It looks alarmingly like a dull hatred of every form of personal superiority. The spoiled children perceive correctly that the superior person is certain, sooner or later, to demand superior things of them, and this interferes with consumption and, above all, with thoughtlessness. It is rather plain by now that even thrift is regarded as evidence of such superiority. Regularly, in the day of social disintegration, there occur systematic attacks upon capital. Though capital may, on the one hand, be the result of unproductive activity, or of theft, as left-wingers might declare, on the other hand, it may be the fruit of industry and foresight, of self-denial, or of some superiority of gifts. The attack upon capital is not necessarily an attack upon inequity. In the times which we describe, it is likely to be born of love of ease, detestation of discipline, contempt for the past. For, above all, an accumulation of capital represents an extension of past effort into the present. But self pampering, present minded modern man looks neither before nor after. He marks inequalities of condition, and, forbidden by his dogmas to admit inequalities of merit, moves to obliterate them. The outcry comes masked as an assertion that property rights should not be allowed to stand in the way of human rights, which would be well enough if human rights had not been divorced from duties. But as it is, the mass simply decides that it can get something without submitting to the discipline of work and proceeds to dispossess. Sir Flinders Petrie has written, "When democracy has attained full power, the majority without capital necessarily eat up the capital of the minority, and the civilization steadily decays." I would suggest as worth considering in this connection the difficulties of the Third Republic in maintaining the ideal of honest toil against the pressure of venality and politics, and, on the other side, the ruthless determination of the Bolsheviks to permit no popular direction of affairs. In the final analysis, this society is like the spoiled child in its incapacity to think. Anyone can observe in the pampered children of the rich a kind of irresponsibility of the mental process. It occurs simply because they do not have to think to survive. They never have to feel that definition must be clear and deduction correct if they are to escape the sharp penalties of deprivation. Therefore, the typical thinking of such people is fragmentary, discursive, and expressive of a sort of contempt for realities. Their conclusions are not earned in the sense of being logically valid, but are seized in the face of facts. The young scion knows that, if he falls, there is a net below to catch him. Hardness of condition is wanting. Without work to do, especially without work that is related to our dearest aims, the mental sinews atrophy, as do the physical. There is evidence that the masses, spoiled by like conditions, incur a similar flabbiness, and in crisis will prove unable to think straight enough to save themselves. That is, in conclusion, a story of weakness resulting from a false world picture. The withering away of religious belief, the conviction that all fighting faiths are due to be supplanted, as Mr. Justice Holmes intimated in a decision, turn thoughts towards selfish economic advantage. The very attainment of this produces a softening. The softening prompts a search for yet easier ways of attaining the same advantage, and then follows decline. So long as private enterprise survives, there remain certain pressures not related to mass aspiration. But when industrial democracy insistently batters at private control, this means of organization and direction diminishes. Society eventually pauses before a fateful question: where can it find a source of discipline?